Bear, how's the recording? How's the view of us look in the recording? It's 2:17, so we're on regulation grief sesh time.
Time to do it.
No, it's okay. It's part of the class, I guess. You know, it's recording, so we're live in the archive, right? Is it looking good for posterity? Huh? Yeah, it's looking good. Okay, and you can maybe maybe you can move the computer to where this plastic case is, and then you can be close. So if we need to give you directions, we're not shouting. And then yeah, get a good spot. There's all this room over here. Get close to the action. It's like you're the live studio audience, so you got to be like right in the place to be like, woo, yeah, yeah, the applause sign. And so we're live because I pressed the recording over there, and so it's recording this prep. But that was interesting in the first session of Grief Sesh, which we just kind of got. We got the we turned the set into nothing. And when we did the first Grief Sesh, we really did, because we all had all this stuff. This old stuff. We had this stuff, but the first time it was fresh stuff. So this was like our first reinstallation, right? An iterative project. You were a viewer, how did the setup go?
I love this setup.
Yeah,
I really thought that it looks really official, and I did like the interaction with the audience. I think that that's always special. I enjoyed viewing the show.
sure.
Yeah, and I want to continue the conversation you had last time.
I love it. Well, you're back here in season 1, episode 2, where we don't have a format, but we'll figure it out. Sesh 2, Grief Sesh 2. And you're an invited guest, Shelbie Loomis. Welcome. You're going to be talking about the Grieving Apothecary, but as I was prefacing, the preface of the first time was what you saw is that this is also like a class, and the conduction of this project and the learning experience as a social practice project, and is a particular investigation about grief and navigating it. But your social practice, well, how do you identify as an artist?
Hey. Well, I am an art and social practice artist, as master artist Michael Stevenson Bernard speaks.
You got it.
I am also kind of like a self-proclaimed socioeconomic economist and a researcher.
That's interesting.
Also, I'm neurodivergent and I have ADHD. So if I mispronounce words, it is a part of the experience.
I love that.
I am currently the director and founder of Park Arts, which is our arts organization. And I have spent a huge part of my art career really diving into grief in different forms, in research, in experience, in social practice, and in like making.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I thought it was really interesting the way that you're identified as like, oh, how do you identify as an artist? And you included neurodivergency, and you also you have like, oh, I am an economic studier practitioner of economics. And you also mentioned you said the director of Park Arts. And so are you the founder of Park Arts as well?
Founder
Director of Park Arts. And so I think it's interesting. You have all these titles and these universes that you navigate. You want to talk about that a little bit? I think this is like the first time we're in a conversation with a person who's working in a socially engaged platform, and we're in the process of actually learning what it even means to have the hands in all these different pots as an artist.
Yeah. And this is something that I'm going to kind of go into with my presentation just briefly, but being a social practice artist and coming back into the arts, I left the art world after graduating with my BFA. I went into finance and was like a bank manager, and I I dealt with a lot of really serious, very tangible, and even traumatic experiences in like corporate settings. And I started kind of working and creating relationships with people. And I thought, well, this is my art. Working with the public, engaging in certain ways in different facets. Social practice has allowed me to research and go into different silos or different modes of learning. And I'm extremely interested in research about about like physiology and how sociology kind of mixes into that, and how do we spend money and what do we culturally find valuable. And so going into the director position, when I graduated, I started Park Arts because I was like, you know what, I'm just going to make a position. And so I've been grant writing, and I created this institution in this RV park that I live in.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And I know that you have been working in this RV context and live in this RV context. It's possible that you have slides related to this, but what is interesting to hear it in context as Park Arts, which is even new to me as we catch up. In at least, I mean, you've mentioned that, but it's interesting to be thinking about it in this context. But yeah, like the kind of arc of that developing, what would be what would be like a sort of timeline based way of contextualizing that?
Sure. So, I mean, it's kind of interesting because I think everyone can kind of agree that like the pandemic really challenged identity, challenged the scope of like everything that we kind of understood about our world. And out of a couple of projects that I'm going to talk about grief, I started working really closely with my neighbors. And my neighbors, I live in an RV park, and a bunch of them are low income, but they're elderly. And I use that, my own grieving of my grandmother to kind of build this relationship with them. And I started drawing them in this project called the Art We Value. And I just asked them to like select an object in their like house and to tell me why they thought it was art. And a lot of people, it like spurred a conversation about what is valuable and what we value in each other. And so that became an art show, which became like my thesis. I made a book, and then we got an award, and then we got grants. And now it's like, how can we continue this forward?
Right.
So I made Park Arts, which is now residents are now artists in residence at the park. And they can do their own research or their own projects with the community.
Yeah. So you're saying that the participants or collaborators who are part of this Park Arts organization, they have a lot of autonomy.
Totally.
Autonomy.
Totally. Right. Like they're collaborators. There's a difference between participation and collaboration. Right. And these 12 residents ended up becoming collaborators because they had a huge decision making in the project itself. And they like have responded, and they're like, we want to keep doing this. And so they are now becoming experts in their own creative practices. And my job as director is to support them in that journey. And so so we just had like a writing workshop, for example, with one of my collaborators. And she started writing when she was burned over 90% of her body and lost her mother in a house fire. And she learned through that process of like catharsis of writing. And I think that there's value in expertise and experience. So
interesting.
Yeah.
When you say there's value in expertise and experience, which has also come up in this class, what do you mean?
Yeah, I think that there's definitely in our society, there's a hierarchy about categorizing, yeah, like people's experiences and their own knowledge base, like saying, oh, I'm qualified to teach a class because I have this degree. But truthfully, like, as we start to kind of like devolve that, you start to realize that like there are people that walk through life and they experience things. And within that set of life and journey, they become an expert to share and teach, and create their own pedagogies. And so I really believe that those people should be put in positions where they can have opportunities to share,
Yeah.
you know.
And what would you say, like, when you became the director of an organization that you founded, would you say you embarked on that with a large amount of experience on how to do exactly that?
No. I mean,
Are you saying you approached it as an amateur?
I mean, like, yeah, so of course I came from a finance background, so I'm pretty used to like, okay, like jumping through hoops, so to speak, like asking questions. I think like as a person going into anything, you just have to be willing to like ask questions. And then like slowly but surely you start getting answers, and then you start putting into practice, and then all of a sudden you grow. And a lot of it is just like kind of claiming it, you know, like even though like I don't have previous director like experience, I'm still direct, like I'm cultivating programming every day, like, you know, and it's like through trials and errors.
Mhm.
You know, you grow every day.
Sure.
So,
And I mean, I think it's kind of interesting. I was talking to and another faculty here. We're looking at this, what I was mentioning, pre-production. So I'm doing, I guess, to give you a little update. So in a similar sense, in a similar sense, but different position in a way. I have been invited to be a part of the Jefferson Modernization Project.
cool.
And that high school is getting like $1 million in bond money to reconfigure, new building, rebuild, you know, it's like a huge overhaul. And there is an administrative team that's a part of both Portland Public Schools and this architecture firm that are kind of engaging the community and like trying to move through a process in which some kind of plan gets established. And it's like weird and doesn't feel that good, and there's a history of it not being that good. And I'm a part of an organization that is subcontracting in this whole huge tectonic plate shifting situation. They brought in these community design organizers, of which I am one. And so, why am I saying this? And so I, you know, am navigating this. Just even earlier today, I was at the butcher shop and we're throwing this event. But, you know, my participation is like, you know, I don't know. Am I a professional? Like, I mean, I think I am, but, you know, the nature of what I'm doing often may be similar to something I've done before, but usually it's like new, you know? And so I'm wearing a lot of new hats. And so, yeah, just a lot of my life and practice, which I do and feel and conduct as an artist, is also kind of, I don't know that I'm entering it feeling like I'm have done it before, or, you know.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. And I think, you know, what's so interesting about this is like kind of going into like everyone has seasons in which they feel competent, right? Or feel like they have the confidence to hold themselves in a particular way, or expose them or open their minds to seeing the larger framework of like the larger picture.
Sure.
And I think like, especially right now, this is kind of going back into grief in general.
Yeah.
That, you know, when we experience any kind of trauma or any kind of grief, that frontal cortex of the brain kind of shuts down.
Right. I remember you saying that.
And so a lot of this, you know, as we're kind of like moving through space and pretending or like operating in some type of mode of like normalcy, there's this like kind of identity crisis where like the brain kind of is negotiating reality. Right. And so like, like to be coming into a class and being like, I'm a student now and I'm going to learn, right, when dealing with grief. And I will say, like, just largely we're all dealing with a form of grief at some point,
of course,
and especially right now coming out of the pandemic.
Sure.
So
yeah, I mean, it was interesting. I was on the phone with a friend prior to coming, and we hadn't spoken since Matoski had passed. Which is, we were talking often during dog walks, and so they're in DC, so it was like a kind of a major gap in our coverage of awareness of life. And she's like, ending a partnership, and she's got kids, and it's like a new partner, and there's all this like stuff, and she was reflecting and saying like maybe some regret or whatever, like could I have tried harder, all this stuff. And I was like, look, like this time in the human genome is like been very disruptive to everyone, and then like that's a specific and general stressor, but things that we have talked about and even planning for this project and talking and thinking through it is just like, yes, there's ways in which you and I have experienced grief in direct correlation to like someone in our lives not being present anymore. But that this premise, and Sarah Gilbert, the first guest, brought up, she used the phrase grieving her marriage, right? Like grieving an ending or transition of some kind, or other ways in which this, and in my own experience, like it was interesting then and now as you're bringing up the prefrontal cortex context, like I've felt very aware of my lack of skill or competency, and like be like, oh, how are you doing? It's like, I don't know. The various fires are manageable, but they are not, embers slow cooking a Cornish hen. Sometimes I throw a frozen pizza on top and see what happens. But that is also, you said when we were talking about climate grief and all these different racial injustice, like all this stuff. It is a form of kind of assault on our senses, so to speak.
Yeah. And I will say just in general, like, it's so interesting because again, I go back to like, generally, like I sit and I research this stuff. So
sure.
When I was going through my particular grief, I had this mode of like deciding of like, do I disassociate or do I just fully throw myself into the chasm of this like feeling?
Right.
And do I really dissect and get really deep in this? And it's so funny because a lot of people in my life were just like really worried. Right. And I about me, and like, why are you lingering so deep in this? Right. And it's like, interesting. If society was so like a lot more nurturing the way that we need it to be, we would be able to heal more efficiently, so that it wouldn't come up in other ways. And what through my research, what I found is you talked about the human genome. Like grief and PTSD has a negative effects on our physical body. So like what they're realizing is like your gut biome, for example, there's like bacteria and viruses, and like the good bacteria in your gut that processes like your food and your stresses and your hormones, everything. The moment the cortisol levels rise, your gut biome is trashed. Right. Okay. In a conjunction with the nasty foods that just destroy our gut biome. They're realizing that the gut and the brain communicate constantly. Okay. So when it's compromised, you have autoimmune issues. You can't sleep, you have anxiety, you have depression, you have autism, you have ADHD, you have cancer and Parkinson's and all of this different stuff. And you realize, oh my God, if we had a culture that actually cared about care and healing, we wouldn't have all these symptoms of basically being a sick society. Yeah. Right. And so like, instead of just pretending everything is okay, like, why don't we just get down it and like have a conversation? right? And connect with people that actually care, right? For our healing and for our well-being, so it was really hard during the pandemic when you're
Sure.
isolated.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, everything you're saying is interesting. I mean, I think about it in my own ways. I think that is some kind of draw for me to community work, is like the ailment of society, and that like there's no way that alone studio practice and really any kind of practice that isn't in a deep and intimate connection with broader communities can I even appeal, because like you'd be like, oh, Timmy needs a basketball, and I could be like, yes, check. But it's like, oh man, he actually needs a ride to basketball camp for the whole summer. And and it's like for the goodness to transfer, to create some sort of semblance of healing on an intergenerational level.
Right.
But also it's like, I remember originally when I was thinking about art, it's like, unless you actually appeal, it's like, gotta have a good meal, gotta have like good moods, gotta have good influences, gotta be learning and feeling challenged. It's like, and in my work with youth, it comes up this paradigm of like the whole child, or I think there's another term, but essentially this holistic form of education where it's not just like knowledge in the brain. It's like, oh, they're burnt out, like nap, it's like, and it's even that's like, whatever, go eat lunch, maybe. But it's like, no, actually we need a nap, and then we need lunchtime, and then, whatever. And so the things you're talking about, I think are just interesting to me in general. Though I'm not particularly exposed to this research, but it's also interesting because it's not confusing to me to hear what you're saying and apply it to my understanding of the world. But the thing that also we talked about and is interesting in the context of this room and program is what you're talking about is a form of like vaguely or specifically scientific research.
Sure.
And so you're like, oh, I'm an artist. And the first thing I did is go deep into this other non-art context in order to, would you describe that, not that I don't understand it, but to like lay it out as a process that you're working through.
Sure. So I mean,
which also segue for a possible segue in now or in the future. At any point, you can also present your work.
Cool.
But we've well prefaced this, but keep going.
Yeah. I will say just generally, like I pride myself on criticality. I know that's like a weird thing to say, but
we're at Read Baby.
Huh?
I said we're at Read Baby.
But
they're watching Monsters Inc. and they're talking about all kinds of analysis, like corporate control and stuff. I was like, okay. They're like, it's Read. We did an analysis on Monsters Inc. And I'm like, is that what Read's like?
Yeah.
Oh man.
Well,
I believe it.
It's great because like you realize, especially as academics, as students, you're not just a right brain and the left brain. You're a combination of both. We are in conversation with language and math and science, and there's all kinds of fields of study that kind of point to each other, right? And historically, it's always been really difficult because there's siloing effects where like fields of knowledge don't communicate to each other really. And so when I had taken a break from arts, I stepped away. I got really into critical thought about economics and sociology and psychology and everything. But when I was going through this deep grief, my first initial response was to be logical. Okay. And what's so interesting is like, that's such a default setting for a lot of us is like, okay, I'm going to critically and analyze my feelings instead of like actually like going into the thing. And so my grandmother was dying in New Mexico and I'm watching her die. And I was the one that like took her to the hospital and found this situation. And the first thing that I decided to do was take an aging economics class and a death and dying psychology class at the same time while she's dying. And so I'm like really deep down in the thicket of like the logical and the psychological, but also like trying to understand my own emotions. Because it was like I was trying to work myself back, right? Instead of just like being a human being and feeling. Okay. And in this class, like I'm looking at like the medical healthcare system, caregivers and complex grief, and how basically we're like have aging population that like we will not escape not being caregivers in our lives. And I was just like being bombarded, but in a way it kind of helped me, like, because I became hyper fixated. And that's one of the things that like I tend to do through my neurodiversities is I become hyper fixated on the research part. But it really helped because it informed my projects. It really informed the way that I talked and engaged with participants and collaborators.
The research informed your projects and helped you talk and collaborate with your participants.
Exactly. And also it kind of like inadvertently helped with addressing my own trauma and like epigenetics and like, family trauma. Like these are things that we're only now starting to talk about. Okay. And so this is like new field stuff, and it's not easy. It's really difficult, to go through systemic racial injustice and, just, trauma through genetics. Like, how does that, come up in my life? It's weird.
Totally. Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, we can jump into my
Gentle
presentation.
primer, yeah. Do a little shuffle. I
Um,
mean, as you shuffle air, yeah, just responding to that. I mean, I think that's a great, as much as that like blows it up, it's a great place to pin where, it's just, I'm having various, I guess, back to the thing, that's why I was saying this. So when I explained the Jefferson modernization thing, I was meaning to also say, and you're sharing, that makes sense. I was meaning to also, so I was meeting with a professor here and we're applying for a grant, working in that same community. And, she was like, man, you're coming up with all these really great ideas, like all this stuff. And I was like, yeah, I mean, it's just like everything is interesting.
Yeah.
Like literally everything, something's going on. And especially in like, let's say a university, everyone's an academic. It's like, oh, I have all this information about this thing. You're like, cool, I know about this stuff. You're like, wow. There's just a lot everywhere. I mean, I think I feel that way in social practice, but, particularly in a collegiate environment. But just also what you explained in the preface to your work and in the way that reality is affecting us as individuals is all these things are connected beyond our ability to like be aware of or see, as if it's not presented to us this way,
Right.
but is also not necessarily, I think it is the art world that as a practice can kind of like tease out and see between the threads of reality more as like you open the book and it's like talking about that, not just like steam pipe fitting, turn 2 clocks, it's like not specific in that way, but yeah, so just in how all of that kind of like lives in what we do. So
I have a lot of thoughts about that. And I mean, I just will just say briefly before I launch in here that art becomes that like, the glue in between. There's so many rules and regulations and structures and procedures on how we approach knowledge. But art, there's so much freedom in being able to follow those through lines. So you can have those hyperfixations, and then you like follow the dopamine and you're like reaching out to different people to talk about different fields of study. And then you start making the connections back. And, that's why I think a lot of times scientists really benefit from taking like an art class. They even said like bodybuilders benefit from taking a ballet class. Like it trains your neuroplasticity to see like a larger field of the larger picture at hand.
Did you say follow the dopamine?
Follow the dopamine.
Have you heard that somewhere?
Yeah, it's a ADHD term.
Interesting. You should make bumper stickers.
Follow the dopamine. Okay, so yeah, again, I'm Shelbie Loomis, and we're going to talk about grief, but we're going to talk about art rituals, like grieving rituals through art. Next slide. Again, I'm Shelbie Loomis. This is me.
Director, founder, Park Arts.
Yeah, I am the director and founder of Park Arts, and it is an artist in residency on Hayden Island, and that's where I live, North Portland. In an RV park / mobile home community. And I'm a social practice artist and illustrator and self-proclaimed economist, whatever. Economist, whatever, words are hard. I'm also a researcher. So next slide. I'm gonna ask you all a question. I mean, I love that you're drawing. This is great because this is actually, I have a type of visual impairment that drawing is actually my form of note-taking. I can quite literally draw and remember what someone said in the drawing. So I'm loving this because to me, this is kind of like note-taking. But I'm gonna ask you all a question. So you're walking down the street and you look up and a car is coming straight towards you, head on. How do you feel? Time to go. It's your time to go. Okay.
Pack my bags. Do you think I packed this morning?
Okay. What else? You're scared. You're scared. Okay. What else?
Is the driver okay? What are they doing?
Oh man, interesting.
What else?
Shocked.
Shocked. Gotcha. Okay. It's a really interesting question. And a lot of times when someone poses this question, it's like, how do you feel? When someone asked me this question, I was like, I would jump out of the way, right? Like, how would I feel? I would jump out of the way. How would I feel? It's time to go. And actually, when you start to think about it, like the feeling part is not an action part. Okay. So the people that were like, I would feel confused. I would feel fearful. I would fear, I would feel. That is more of like a criticality on how closely related you are with your own emotions versus how logic is overdoing, your emotions, so to speak. So I when my mind was blown, right? Because a lot of times people react with, oh, I would jump out of the way. Okay. So next slide. So I'm glad that you are all drawing and I want you to continue to do so. This is why, as we're going through this is really interesting. We're going to watch a little bit of a video talking about PTSD, but what PTSD is and what it does to the brain. And this is important because this kind of you can kind of understand and put yourself in my shoes of this criticality and this logical form of research. And how I'm starting to unpack that and strip away the logic and get a little bit more into my emotions. So next slide. Okay. Brief video. Yeah. Play it. Hopefully we can hear it.
It's on your computer.
Oh.
Or it would
Wait,
be
turn it up.
share computer sound. View the canvas. Can you share computer sound?
I think it was.
Sharing and then turn up the volume.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Well, how about this?
Yeah. Is the speakers?
Yeah, the speaker should be good. Is it going up?
Many of us will experience some kind of trauma during our lifetime. Sometimes we escape with no long-term effects, but for millions of us, those experiences linger, causing symptoms like flashbacks, nightmares, and negative thoughts that interfere with everyday life. This phenomenon, called post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, isn't a personal failing. Rather, it's a treatable malfunction of certain biological mechanisms that allow us to cope with dangerous experiences. To understand PTSD, we first need to understand how the brain processes a wide range of ordeals, including the death of a loved one, domestic violence, injury or illness, abuse, rape, war, car accidents, and natural disasters. These events can bring on feelings of danger and helplessness, which activate the brain's alarm system, known as the fight, flight, freeze response. When this alarm sounds, the hypothalamic, pituitary, and adrenal systems, known as the HPA axis, work together to send signals to the autonomic nervous system. That's the network that communicates with adrenal glands and internal organs to help regulate functions like heart rate, digestion, and respiration. These signals start a chemical cascade that floods the body with several different stress hormones, causing physiological changes that prepare the body to defend itself. Our heart rate speeds up, breathing quickens, and muscles tense. Even after a crisis is over, escalated levels of stress hormones may last for days, contributing to jittery feelings, nightmares, and other symptoms. For most people, these experiences disappear within a few days to 2 weeks as their hormone levels stabilize. But a small percentage of those who experience trauma have persistent problems, sometimes vanishing temporarily, only to resurface months later. We don't completely understand what's happening in the brain, but one theory is that the stress hormone cortisol may be continuously activating the fight, flight, freeze response while reducing overall brain functioning, leading to a number of negative symptoms. These symptoms often fall into 4 categories: intrusive thoughts, like dreams and flashbacks, avoiding reminders of the trauma, negative thoughts and feelings like fear, anger, and guilt, and reactive symptoms like irritability and difficulty sleeping. Not everyone has all these symptoms or experiences them to the same extent and intensity. When problems last more than a month, PTSD is often diagnosed. Genetics, ongoing overwhelming stress, and many risk factors like pre-existing mental illnesses or lack of emotional support likely play a role in determining who will experience PTSD. But the underlying cause is still a medical mystery. A major challenge of coping with PTSD is sensitivity to triggers, physical and emotional stimuli that the brain associates with the original trauma. These can be everyday sensations that aren't inherently dangerous, but prompt powerful physical and emotional reactions. For example, the smell of a campfire could evoke the memory of being trapped in a burning house. For someone with PTSD, that memory activates the same neurochemical cascade as the original event. That then stirs up the same feelings of panic and helplessness, as if they're experiencing the trauma all over again. Trying to avoid these triggers, which are sometimes unpredictable, can lead to isolation. That can leave people feeling invalidated, ignored, or misunderstood, like a pause button has been pushed on their lives while the rest of the world continues around them. But there are options. If you think you might be suffering from PTSD, the first step is an evaluation with a mental health professional who can direct you towards the many resources available. Psychotherapy can be very effective for PTSD, helping patients better understand their triggers. And certain medications can make symptoms more manageable, as can self-care practices like mindfulness and regular exercise. What if you notice signs of PTSD in a friend or family member? Social support, acceptance, and empathy are key to helping and recovery. Let them know you believe their account of what they're experiencing, and that you don't blame them for their reactions. If they're open to it, encourage them to seek evaluation and treatment. PTSD has been called the hidden wound because it comes without outward physical signs. But even if it is an invisible disorder, it doesn't have to be a silent one. Mental health conditions impact millions of people around the world, yet are often misunderstood. Check out this playlist to get informed.
All right. So, are we still?
Yeah, we should. I guess you're muted before it. This is muted entirely.
Yeah, not.
But
Yeah, turn down the volume on that one. Technology.
technology, that's why we got a tech person.
Yeah, so the reason why I put this video is because it just kind of. Okay, next slide. So a little bit of context, like I have a form of PTSD through going through a lot of different traumas that I didn't even recall until I was in my grief. And what often happens, and especially in situations publicly, is that people really shrink away from grief because it does pull up a lot of emotions and a lot of past wounds that they're not really equipped to kind of address. And so when my grandmother was dying, I had a recall of a whole bunch of emotions and memories that I was having to kind of digest alongside of, kind of coming to terms with like basically my mother dying. My grandmother was, the primary caregiver for me, and my mom was young when she had me. She was 19, and so it like kind of understanding a little bit about PTSD allowed me to kind of get into understanding the articles I was kind of reading through when I was going through this process, which was talking about complex grief. And so when people have that type of trauma, they walk around with more probability for complex grief that can last a really long time. So when my grandmother was grieving, people were concerned because they were like, you're getting really deep, really hot, like fast. And I think it was just a symptom of them themselves feeling uncomfortable with their own emotions.
Interesting.
So next slide. So I called her Anya. And she, like, in this process became my muse. I started cultivating rituals and like recording her and doing as much projects and as much research as I could with the limited time I had with her. And I was here in Portland, she was in New Mexico. Next slide. Next slide, drawing connections. During this time, I started reading this book, and I reread it often. There were multiple things that I was doing in turn, like intuitively, that it didn't really make sense. But later on, I was able to make connections as I was kind of making my way back to my own emotions. And this is when women were birds. And this passage is like about talking about this woman, this author who's losing her mother, and she's stroking her back. Her mother's dying of cancer. And she says, I'm leaving you with all my journals. She said, facing the shuttered windows as I continue to rub her back. But you must promise me that you will not look at them until I'm gone. Next slide. I opened the first journal and it was empty. Next slide. I opened the second journal, it was empty. I opened the third, it too was empty, and the fourth and the fifth and the sixth. Shelf after shelf after shelf, my mother's journals were blank. Okay. So in this passage, I would reread this over and over again, and like I was able to feel the compassion I felt for a person in a book. But it was really difficult for me to fathom that like suddenly someone is gone, and if they had not completed something, or if they had not finished writing, or I had thrown away for anything, it was like suddenly they didn't exist. And when I was reading this book over and over again, I became extremely like sentimental and precious about objects, mainly objects or things that like were relating to her or relating to the people that were close to me. I like almost felt like I was like collecting or hoarding in like little different ways, because I was feeling so helpless. Next slide. So one of the last times I saw her, I was taking pictures of my house, and I was taking pictures of her hands and just trying to like memorize as much as I could. But there's definitely a feeling of like helplessness in that mode of existing. Next slide. Next slide. So I went in her house and I realized that there were a lot of artifacts of things that I had shared with this individual. And I like mentally made her this collaborator in my grief. She, we had this favorite building that she took me when I was like 13, 14, and she painted it and I painted it. And I decided that I was going to take all of the places that she existed in and draw them all together. So that I could kind of like imagine like her existence was like thin dust or like sawdust. And like I was just trying to collect the sawdust. Next slide. This tree in the front yard, I took a piece of the wood and I started whittling this kind of like spirit stick, that I called it. And anytime I was feeling particularly vulnerable, I would just kind of like weave into it. And it was from this poplar tree that I had gone to take up that stump for her, and suddenly had to take her to the hospital because she was having a heart attack. Next slide. And braiding hair. Next slide. So one of the things that was really sentimental was like hair. And I think a lot of times it's kind of like this really strange kind of phenomenon about collecting hair. There's kind of like this creepiness to it. But when I was stressing and in my grief, I would be consciously like braiding my hair like a lot. And when the last few times I was with her, her hair was falling out in these huge clumps due to the cancer. And so this piece, I had taken both of our hairs and I had wove it together in this piece of the poplar tree that I had also taken. And while she was dying, I submitted this piece to be put in a show, and it was like going to be a 3-month show outside because it was a pandemic. And the idea was that, you know, by the time the show was ended, I will have said my last goodbye. And so this became like a time traveler of our relationship that was going to be exposed to the elements and to change from start to finish.
This one I saw pretty fascinating, and there's some kind of Latosca hair things that I'm up to myself. But in the context of this group conversation experience, it's like a really beautiful example of this object permanence that's in correlation to this complex topic. That's also like a social project that has a research component, but then there is this thing that exists that has visual qualities, and in a way I think if you were just to try to like interpret it visually, you could not interpret the whole meaning, because the meaning is actually rooted in these things that are also undeniable. It's not like wax poetic, like, oh, I imagined that on the 6th planet of this imagined world that there's this thing and it means this thing. It's like real. It's like this object is from my grandmother's yard, and the hair, you know, and that the thing is undeniably what you claim it is, in a an atomic number way.
Yeah, and also, and this might be something that you're talking about in your art and social practice class, is thinking about audience. Okay. In this piece, the audience was me and my grandmother, right? Like, and anyone like could be like a tertiary audience member, right? Like they could kind of understand, like your understanding about this piece as like a bystander looking out, like inward, right? But the people that really would get the mode of this work was just me and her. This was supposed to be an intimate exchange. And so thinking about audience, that's why, you know, like you made the remark about like, oh, I wouldn't get that if I were looking at it. It's like, right. Thinking about audience, especially about your projects, is extremely important and should be intentional. Yeah, next slide. So when she did die, she died at home, and I was on Zoom. And when she died and they were calling the coroner to come and pick her up, I panicked and I told my mother and my aunt that I wanted a piece of her hair. And in the confusion, they cut off her entire braid. Okay. And it was very it was extremely raw for the family, because that wasn't something that like they had realized that someone would request. But it was extremely emotional for my family. And so my mom traveled and brought her braid to me. And especially because I myself grow my hair out, I became obsessed with her braid, and I would draw it over and over and over and over again. Just trying to kind of really realize the significance of like how a person can exist 1 minute and then not exist the next. And next slide. So I did a social practice collective during pandemic called Braiding, and it was just a group of women, identified people, braiding their hair. And there's something very sacred about braiding hair, or even teaching each other how to braid hair. Next slide. So this really informed other projects, and I'll kind of go through them quickly because I want to be conscientious of time. We're good? Okay. Next slide. I started the Grieving Apothecary, and I started the Red Tent. And they're basically two very small modes of working individually or with a small group of intentional people to cultivate ritual. And next slide. I started collecting things in jars, and for a good year during my grief, I collected a whole bunch of stuff, and this is what I'm going to be sharing with you. And I didn't know what it was, but I was trying to find some kind of antidote to these like emotions I was having. And the way I was like attaching it to these ingredients, and I didn't know, it was like very intuitive, but I just felt like I had to do it. Next slide. The Red Tent was an ongoing conversation, especially virtually, with women in my life. I felt like I didn't have a lot of capacity for too many people, especially strangers. And so I started reaching out to other people, particularly women, identified people that I really felt safe with. And I would ask them about their grief, and in turn, I would draw their picture. Next slide. And so these are some examples of some people that I talked to during this time. And this actually started a whole series of body of work that I kind of would do later on in other projects. Next slide. The grieving walk. So during this time, a little backstory, I used to be a bodybuilder. The gym's closed. And something about grief is that a lot of times when we're in that like fight or flight, PTSD mode, our nervous system doesn't have a means to get rid of the cortisol out of our body. And so being in action, physically lifting weights or walking actually helps lower the nervous system and allows your body to go into what's called rest and digest. Okay. And so I wasn't able to go to the gym. And so I started this grieving walk on PSU campus. Next slide. And it was every Monday for 1 hour, I would walk in a circle, dragging a stick with a piece of chalk. And I would carve out a space every Monday for 1 hour, and I'd walk. And it became this like continuous line drawing almost. But in a way, I felt like I had to figure out how to carve a physical space in public to be okay with grieving, right? And people could come and they could activate it. There were sticks that they could walk with me. They didn't have to walk the entire time. They could walk in silence, or they could talk to me. It was completely up to them. Next slide. So as I was walking, I wore this grieving shirt, and it really like put me out, like outlined me into the public sphere where people would look at, like they would avert their eyes, you know? And a lot of times it was like, I got used to being invisible. But as I continued, like at first I would wear these headphones because I was feeling very vulnerable about breathing in public space. But eventually I took off my headphones, and I would start making eye contact with people. And a couple of times the people would just make a simple eye contact with me back. I got really emotional. And I would keep a log of my interactions with the public. And I did this for 12 weeks of just constantly walking. And I was making kind of like kind of like scientific notes about my engagement in this project. Next slide. So these are some examples of my notes, and eventually people would come back and be like, I've watched you walk for weeks. What's happening? Are you like, they wanted to understand the project. And so, and a couple of people actually decided to pick up the stick and walk with me because they could tell that someone, like, I was hurt, I was grieving, but then through our conversations, they realized that they were also grieving. Next slide. It got to the point where eventually I had many, contributors or participants in this project. And this person who's walking away right now, one of the last times that I activated this project, I think it was Labor Day, and she had lost her cousin, like in the military 1 year previous, like on that day. And so very quietly, she just picked it up, did like kind of like this ritual for him, and like continued on with her day. And, I did have a moment to like ask her name and to ask her why she decided to participate. And she just was like, I didn't have any other way to express this thing that happened to me in my day. So walking in a circle for a brief amount of time was more than enough to dedicate that to my grief. Next slide.
And it's interesting, we talked about a similar concept where I mentioned a lot of my own practices in correlation to like a yearning. So it's not like an abundance. And I'm like, oh, everyone, like, we do this football game. It's like, well, I don't have a method in which I'm convening with people that's meeting my needs. Like, let me create that.
Right.
And so I think most humans, as a society, we have rituals that are like Netflix and chill. Like, they're so kind of broad spectrum that everyone is like reaching towards something. And it's like what we have, but it is like devoid of all of the complexity and richness of ritual that exists centuries before, that obviously existed for some reason that kind of manifests external to the body, etc. And so, yeah, people are searching for these things that they encounter us like, oh, I'm over here doing this. And like, that sounds great. I've been looking for a thing that does something.
Yeah, exactly. And what's so interesting about that is that, yes, because a lot of our rituals have been forgotten.
Sure.
Okay. But isn't it interesting how it still resides within our DNA?
Oh, yeah.
Right. Where it becomes still like this desire, but we can't articulate it. We just know that there's a desire. Right. And so, I got into this mode of just like wearing this grieving shirt everywhere I went. And it was like weird to contemplate how they're called secondary places, which is basically like, okay, so you have home and school and work. Those are your primary places that you exist, but you also have secondary places, okay? Like the gym, a club, or the movies, or wherever, where you go to commune with other people and just have like leisure time, okay? And so I was realizing that there was like no place for me to have these conversations, but I needed to be in action and I needed to be in conversation. So I would wear this like grieving shirt to the gym. I'd wear it to the grocery store. I'd wear it because I wanted to be like in these secondary places where I could talk to people about this and see if I could connect in a little bit more of a human mode. And honestly, I'll tell you, it didn't happen. People avoided me like the plague. Maybe it's because it was a black shirt, maybe because it said grieving and they thought it was a band. I think that it was extremely uncomfortable. I became a sore thumb sticking out in society, and people just would not want to engage with that. And that to me showed just kind of the symptom of our society in general, right?
Yeah.
Like, we're having a conversation about this is awesome, but this doesn't happen, right? Especially in our families, we don't know. There are people that don't even acknowledge, right? So anyway, I started wearing this everywhere. Okay, next slide. So this is kind of like a jump forward 1 year. So this is 1 year from my grandmother's death. And I was accepted into this artisan residency called Subtle Lodge. And I stayed in this lodge for 2 weeks without water.
What does that mean? You mean there was no water, but you consumed water?
No, running water.
Got it.
It was in the dead of winter and I had to hike across there's a huge lake and you hike across to take a shower and to wash your dishes and to whatever. But during my time there, I was like immersed in this huge storm, but it was awesome. It was like the best time of my life. Next slide. So I had just gotten there and I like got into this residency with this like sentimentality of coming to this place to say goodbye. To say like a conclusion to 1 year of grief and being constantly in this mode of research. It still evolves and still continues, but it's not quite as raw. And so this picture I took right when I got there, it was right before the storm hit and I had just recently gotten engaged, like a few hours previous. My grandmother's death was right there. And I was with my dog who also has like, he's very nervous. He has a lot of PTSD because he got hit by a truck. And so I was like very emotional, but it was very awesome. Next slide. I started imagining that there was a healing house that hovered above the lake. And I was mentally and like psychically and emotionally connecting to this like hovering island. And I draw it. Next slide. But I didn't want to be isolated. I was tired of being isolated. And so I reached out to the people that worked at Subtle Lodge. And I sat them down and asked them, I'm like, what is a grieving ritual for you? And they gave me some advice and I took some quotes down and I drew them as an exchange. Next slide. And I made this zine. So at the end of the residency, I gave them their own copy of their own zine. And I activated the Grieving Apothecary for the first time publicly. I hadn't done it. I had done it through the pandemic. It was the first time I activated it in public. Next slide. So this really, like, all of this research has really informed this whole thing about being a director of park arts and doing this project called The Art We Value. I'm like immersed in this whole community of an aging population that has their own emotional needs, and they're also extremely isolated. And so I started this project and got everyone together for the first time during the pandemic. Michael was there. And it was really awesome to be able to sit around and talk about art and talk about value and like, why do we value relationships and art and what can we do next, next slide. And so since then, Park Arts has evolved into doing stuff publicly and creating public programming and allowing people to express, some of these negative emotions into something that's a lot more hopeful and a lot more a lot more in depth instead of superficial, right? And that's kind of like what my objective for Park Arts has always been, is to like deepen those relationships and those community bonds. Yeah, so that's what I got.
Very cool.
Yeah.
You want to end share screen? And I think that was like, we covered a lot of bases and yeah, do the like though I guess we could just turn off the projector, but should we turn off the projector or yes. So that was great. I think we really did the thing. And I think there was a lot of good coverage about, which was interesting when we were planning for this. We're like, all this stuff, and I was like, it'll come up, I'm sure. But it makes it feel appropriate for questions before we segue to our post-talk workshop experience.
Yeah.
Everyone should ask at least one question.
I'm also excited to look at these drawings if you feel so inclined.
Yeah.
They will be going with your grieving antidotes. So
I love it.
yeah, just I want to hear questions.
Yeah. About
Great.
anything.
Yeah.
About like, Shelbie being an artist or working in community or whatever.
Yeah.
And the next time we have a guest, you'll ask questions. So if you're like, but I wasn't thinking of a question, you will next time.
Yeah.
And this time, but you'll be prepared for next time.
Maybe general questions.
I like there's a tension, I guess, for me, between like my personal grieving practice and like the traditional grieving like ritual in China. Like you're not supposed to wear like colors, sort of white or black, and like it's like some people take it like really seriously. It's like you just should not entertain yourself. Don't eat meat. Don't entertain yourself. Just be sad. I'm like that just makes me sadder. And so
Yeah.
and I think it's like there's tension between like, oh, but when I just feel like how I was feeling, if I just keep doing the things I was doing, or like oh, I changed things because of it, but like is it suppressing me more, or is it like actually exploring like what the thing that
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up. I mean, one of the things that is an ongoing conversation is about bereavement time periods, right? So like when you graduate, you have a job, you somehow something happens to you, and then like your job will dictate how long you can grieve before you have to go back to work, right? And so as people like in our society, we don't really value it. Like the most people will give for bereavement is like 2 or 3 days in a year, right? So what happens when like, someone in your family dies of COVID, and then someone else, dies of COVID, right? And we were in a position where there wasn't even any like application to actually have a mode of grieving, so in terms of like other cultures making the space, right? Like granted, making conditions for the space, I don't really like people do it in their own way, right? And that's why it's so personal and individual. But I think without creating any opportunity to have a conversation, to sit with yourself, right? To actually like pose and be like, do I feel okay? Like, am I okay? Then it's like, then that becomes like a festering wound, right? So you have like two polar opposites, right? Like, I mean, yeah. Like the whole idea of like making someone wear black for like a whole entire year, when that's like not really like authentic, that's like a strange ritual too.
Well, something that I was going to bring up earlier is I was found out about this like indigenous African tribe that they would like make these kind of incision cuts markings, but they were kind of like tick marks and like pattern whenever they were thinking of someone, like, and it's interesting because like photos of these folks, like they'll be like fully covered. And I don't remember what I was thinking about before, but I was thinking about it recently. Like, yeah, you may think about the same person like several times a day or every day, and there's this ritual, and that ritual is like so ingrained in that cultural group. But as like culture and times change, there's actually a need and a want for like a different and more relevant ritual. And this, whether it's grief or otherwise, we looked at the future farmers and the flatbread society and these different ways to convene people around a want and a need for a new thing that we're yearning.
Right.
Great comment. Others? We could do a pan.
you talked about your work with like the community that you live in. I was curious, you gave like a couple examples of like the projects, but what is the at this moment, what is the when you're working on this? It sounds very interesting. I was curious as like what the level of engagement with that is, and like the size and the scope of it.
The size and the scope of the engagement in the community. Yeah, so September, I mentioned one of my collaborators, her name is Benita Alia, and she was the burn victim who experienced this very traumatic experience in her life, and then became a writer as a byproduct. And so Park Arts, we have a small committee, we selected her to be the September artist in resident. And what she wanted to do was she wanted to cultivate a writing workshop, which for her, she had never like conceptualized herself as a teacher or having any kind of pedagogy. And it was the first time where she was like, okay, well, this is what I'm going to be doing, like asking people to sit down and like, I'm going to lead them through prompts. And it wasn't like, there wasn't any kind of end goal. It was supposed to be, it's like the catharsis of sitting with others, writing allowed for people to bring up stories and get into storytelling. And so we're going to be cultivating a zine of pulling all the little short stories together. And next month, we have a artist, her name is Phoenix Wolf, and she's a Jewish performer, opera singer that just moved into the community, and she's going to be giving a concert for people, and she's going to be singing songs in Hebrew. And I think a lot of this is just about being able to cultivate space for people to kind of explore their creative practices publicly, but like, you know, with their neighbors who love them and who like see them every day. They go to bingo together on Wednesdays, you know, and to allow them to feel like they're building up their confidence, because especially in communities that don't have opportunities, you know, you have minority communities. It's about how to give them that mode of confidence building and like putting them forward. My interaction is a little bit more supportive in this. I'm calling it a art project. Park Arts is a project. But the engagement really ranges from 10 people to 60 people. But the community is about 450 people. So, yeah.
Wow. I never really knew about that volume.
Yeah, we have 3 communities on the island. Yeah, and we're kind of in this interesting position because Portland is expanding the I-5 bridge, and it's possible that this community might not exist in 3 years. So like gentrification really enters into that. Like, you know, people have all of these stressors that they walk around with, and it's like, how can we just find ways to like release that, because it's affecting people's health, you know, especially elderly people, such as my community. So, yeah. Yeah, any other questions? We can transition. Oh, yeah.
Well, how did you kind of like, is it a discovery that art and like drawing and creating like that was relief for like grief specifically, or just like stress? Like, because I think, I don't know, something I'm interested in what we talked about this class too. Yeah, with like the expertise thing, where it's like something like a skill you already have that like kind of just like lives in you and kind of comes naturally to you. Like, do you feel like, I don't know, yeah, I guess I'm just wondering what your kind of relationship with like kind of like fine arts is, and like how that kind of has its place in like how you draw people and like kind of
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because like I only recently started drawing realistic again within the last 3 years. A lot of my drawings are just like these continuous like cross-hatch drawings that don't like make any sense. They're just very like organic forms. But it's mainly because of my like neurodiversity. So like note taking, I would just draw. And so it calms me because it is something that is like natural. The neural pathways in my brain allows me just to like turn off my critic for a moment and like have a moment to like just feel and not like be super critical. I mean, that's always existent, especially in like in an artist fine art context. The critic is always present, but it's like, how can you get into the flow state, you know, where you're like creating and things are just organically happening. And so for me, I'm constantly searching for that in drawing. And so when I was drawing like this continuous line drawing, walking, okay, what's happening to me is like, I'm able to breathe for once, I don't feel like anxiety's on my chest all the time. I can be outside, I can, I can draw and just watch the line as I'm walking, as it's getting more and more like, buried. And it's like getting back to the basics, and I think for a lot of people, we overcomplicate things. It doesn't have to be complicated. It's just like, can we just like go back to baking bread? And like, this is my practice, is I'm baking bread, because I can release some of the anxiety. So, yeah, hopefully that answered your question. Any questions?
Come up with a question about PTSD because I've been diagnosed with PTSD and I'm interested in more exploring that more, especially because I can't seem to find a therapist who is able to help me with another more aspect of something else. So I just haven't been able to really explore that or explore strategies on it. But also there's part of my mind that's just kind of blocking out any questions about it. So I'm having a hard time coming up with something else. I don't know if there's anything you can take from that.
Yeah. I mean, I will say that like, as a person who has PTSD and then, blocking the brain, you're constantly fighting with yourself, unfortunately. Like, but you don't have to, like, doing the work is good. Like, it's good work, right? But there's nothing like wrong with you, right? Like, there's nothing wrong. It's just a means of figuring out how to kind of hold the space with the questions you have about your life and about that situation and where you presently sit. And being able to, like, if you don't have a means of like resource or like therapy or whatever, I mean, that can be a goal long term. Being able to create and being in that constant mode of working and moving, it like for me, it really helps. It really does. And then language comes later. Then you can be like, oh, I have a thought about this, and then you can write it down, right? So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
On this side of the pool.
As we were talking a lot about like how you kept the brain a lot. I was just wondering, maybe this is I was like you talked about your relationship with your own hair post that, if it was impacted at all.
Yeah, I mean, I've been growing my hair a lot, and actually it was way longer. It was like I have trimmed it. When I made that piece, I had a piece back here that I cut short, and I purposely recut and kept it short. It's since grown out, which to me is like my own personal like process of healing, like accepting that I've healed since then. But what's kind of interesting about my hair is that when I got COVID in May, and I've been losing my hair. And I'm like coming to terms with that. Like, what does that mean? Like, and that's, like the things that are inside of our control and outside of our control is just constant. Right. But yeah, I mean, I keep my hair long, I braid it. And when I'm in meetings, I'm constantly braiding my hair. I feel like you probably, I don't know. I was on Zoom constantly braiding my hair and doing like these weird, like not good, not good braids, but it's like cathartic. I think that's the point, is that it's cathartic. And actually, since I started this braiding project, my sister moved to London recently and she cut her hair and she gave me a braid. And it was like, you're coming back, right? But it was like, suddenly like my family is like, it was such a huge thing for my family that we're deciding that like when that happens, we cut our hair when these major shifts in our lives happen. And I think there's a tribe, I think it's this, there's a type of tribe that does that, cutting hair.
Sure. I thought it was interesting you like created a ritual for your family, right? Like it was not a kind of cultural practice that existed within your immediate familial context and is now like building a cultural tradition.
Yeah, and actually it's funny because there are things called grieving wreaths, which are basically hair wreaths. Like made in the 1800s, where people would, anytime there was a death or a marriage, people would cut their hair and ornately design these massive wreaths. And so they're like family trees of human hair. And it's like creepy, but also fascinating. And so I kind of am plotting to start like a family tree wreath of like ornate design.
Have you ever told you how Rachel Mulder does these shower drawings, shower friends, and it's her hair that falls out and she like makes a draw like a line art drawing. We'll talk
No,
about
I love that. I love that.
So she studied also these.
These hair things, yeah, it's wonderful.
We're almost there.
I mean, talking about great rituals, I was thinking about my own family, but I was thinking about it, we definitely, you know, have that, like, I don't know, it's not like, but I think that's label as a great ritual, like a tradition that my family was doing, but like, I think probably like 10 years ago, my Lola, grandma, asked, and like, she used to do, she felt like off the going to bridge. I don't know if it was like for her birthday or just like did it occasionally on occasion. But like now I feel like every year, like I've missed a couple of years. That's why it's like not just another month quite as much, but I just do it every year and I just like never thought of it. I was through school, but someone in my family like spiritual.
Mhm.
That's just like that right. I just got it.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what I can say to that is that I think that that's fascinating, and I challenge you to find ways of how could you activate that here, right? I mean, we're connected through time and space to individuals through a lot of ways. And I think, location is a big thing, right? Like, oh, I can't do it because I'm not there, right? Or I missed it because of whatever. Yeah, but to move as like a tribal unit, to do something is like, it's extremely powerful. But we only kind of talk about it, it's like, oh, we do it this quirky thing, we go on a walk and everyone's like, like it doesn't make it a lot of sentimental connection until they themselves exist in that and they understand the significance of that. Yeah, so yeah, I'm interested. You should turn that into a sober practice project.
I don't have any questions. I just think what you're saying.
Thank you for. No, thank you for sharing your vulnerability. That's right. No, don't apologize. Like, that is awesome. Because like we have these people who are so significant, and as artists, we have the ability to just really expand that and deepen that, and listen, I cry every day. Like, just relationships, we're so like, there's so much gratitude we have, and that needs to be shared more often. So I'm also looking at your drawing and I'm like loving it.
Excellent. Well, on that note, gratitude. We'll do one final. Thank you for coming. And that concludes episode 2 talk session of Grief Sesh, but thanks for, you were gonna be on the original panel. So you, in a way, your inability to attend created the series.
Hey.
So, yeah.
Let it continue.
Indeed.
Let the work continue.
Also, do you speak sign language?
Me?
Yeah,
No.
because your hand gestures seem like very, like you did something with water, and I was like, is that water? But anyway, yeah,
I have to talk with my hand.
yeah, doing great. Anyway,
Cool.
we'll conclude this recording.
Okay.
And you